He had developed severe altitude sickness, likely cerebral edema. Their oxygen was running low. He drifted in and out of consciousness, hallucinating, losing sense of time, reality, losing his sense of self. Oh, there you are. I have a story that might help you with what you're going through. So this is how it goes. So near the summit of Mount Everest, at an altitude where helicopters can't reach you, where the oxygen barely exists, and where the cold doesn't just hurt but slowly shuts your body down, here was a man. His body was almost already gone. Not missing, not unconscious, but maybe still alive, or was he gone already? His entire team had actually stopped helping him, and they had actually even sent a radio message. His family, thousands of miles away, had already heard the words that no one ever wants to hear. He did not make it. So suddenly they left him. He didn't have an oxygen tank, he didn't have food or water, and there was no protection from the night coming. Because in that moment, leaving him wasn't a choice, it was all about survival at that point. And then something happened that still doesn't make sense to this day, because the next morning, a group of climbers found him sitting there, cross-legged, exposed to the open sky, just inches away from a 1,000-foot drop. And was he still alive? They looked at him, and they were the ones who didn't really belong there, because the first thing he said, believe this? I imagine you're surprised to see me here. What's up, everyone? Welcome back to Daniel Tells Stories, where we dive into real stories from around the world that feel so intense and so emotional and, quite honestly, almost so unbelievable to be real. But if you're into stories like this about real survival or insane true events or moments that sound like movies but actually did happen, make sure you hit that subscribe button right now and stick around, because this channel is all about bringing you stories like this from around the world, and you don't want to miss what's coming next. So if you've been here before, you might remember the other survival story I talked about with Jose Salvador Alvarenga, the man who was trapped in the ocean alone for 438 days, but somehow he did survive. So if you're curious about that story, you must watch on my channel. But today's story is actually pretty different. This one's not just about survival. This was about a man who was actually legally declared dead and he left behind on Mount Everest, yet somehow made it through the night where no human being was supposed to survive. This is an incredible story of Lincoln Hall, the man who came back from death. Before anyone called it a miracle, Lincoln Hall was just a man who understood something that most people spend their lives avoiding, which is the quiet truth that when you're on the mountains, you're never in control, and you're only allowed to be there as long as everything goes right. He grew up in Canberra, Australia, drawn not for recognition, but to something quieter. That feeling of when you're standing in places where every step matters and every decision carries consequences. And if you really think about it, it raises a question that most people never have to answer. What kind of people return to places where one mistake can cost everything, as we've seen many times in our own lives, but not out of recklessness, but because that's where they feel the most alive? Over time, climbing became part of who he was, shaping how he handled fear and how he understood risk. And while he had studied zoology, his real education came from the cold, the storms, and the isolation that forces you to face yourself without distraction. Everest was in the back of his mind. It wasn't just a mountain, it was an unfinished thing. He had tried once in 1984 and turned back near the summit. And that decision alone says everything about him. Because would you have the discipline to walk away from something you're so close to getting that you'd risk everything to say that you've made it? Because turning back on Mount Everest is not a weakness, it's awareness. So more than 20 years later, he came back older, carrying more experience instead of ego, and carrying understanding instead of urgency, still driven and still focused, yet maybe seeing the mountain more clear than he had before. And this time, he did reach the summit. That should have been his ending, as you might think. But if you've been paying attention, you already know from this channel, this is not where the story begins, and this is not where it actually matters. So standing at the summit of Mount Everest is something very few people in the world will ever experience. And for that brief moment, Lincoln Hall had done it. He had reached the top after everything it took to get there. But what most people don't realize is that the summit's only halfway, because getting down is where the real danger begins. As he started his descent, something inside him began to fail, slowly and quietly, as his brain was being starved of oxygen, causing his thoughts to distort, his judgment to break down, and his sense of reality to slip further and further out of reach. He had developed severe altitude sickness, likely cerebral edema. And I want you to think about that for a second, because that isn't just exhaustion, it's your mind no longer working the way it should. So how can you survive when you can't trust your own thoughts? The Sherpas tried to help him, guiding him and supporting him step by step, but Lincoln resisted, not because he didn't want to live, because he no longer could understand what was happening. Imagine how difficult that is when you're trying to save someone who's unknowingly fighting against you. The hours passed, the light faded, and the temperature, of course, dropped, turning the mountain into something much colder and darker and far less forgiving, until they reached a moment that every climber really fears. Their oxygen was running low. And suddenly, this was no longer about Lincoln and what he was going through. This was about the entire group. So let me ask you this. If staying meant risking your own life, would you stay? Because the order came through. Leave him. So after a long time, they'd done everything they could, and staying would only mean more deaths. So they made a decision. They removed his oxygen and his supplies and walked away. Not because they didn't care about him, but because they believed he was truly already gone. And as night fell over Everest, Lincoln Hall was left there alone. Like so many times, we will feel the same way in the middle of our storm of our life. So this is where logic just stops working, because no one would survive that 8,600 meters above sea level, what climbers call that death zone. Your body is shutting down, and even when you have proper equipment, it would be shutting down. But Lincoln, he had nothing. He had no gloves to protect his hands, no goggles to shield his eyes, and no oxygen to keep his brain functioning. The temperature dropped far below freezing, so cold enough it turned his exposed skin black within minutes. He drifted in and out of consciousness, hallucinating, losing sense of time, reality, losing his sense of self. Hours passed like fragments, broken moments, disconnected thoughts. But somewhere in the darkness, something did shift. Not physically, but mentally. He became aware, enough to realize where he was, enough to understand that he had been left behind, enough to remember something that mattered to him more than the mountain and the climb and everything he had done, more than the cold, and more especially than the exhaustion. It was his family. He had made a promise to them that he would come home. And in that moment, when his body should have already given up, he made a decision. He refused to die. Later, he would describe it in the simplest way possible. It was a case of me rejecting death and insisting on life. And somehow, through a combination of experience, instinct, mental strength, and something no one really can fully explain, he, believe it or not, survived the night. So if you can imagine, as first light morning slowly reaches the slopes of Mount Everest, and you feel the wind and the snow and everything else, here comes another group of climbers led by Danielmligon, who was already moving upward, focused, and they were exhausted by this point, but still driven by the same goal that had pushed them this far, which was the summit was finally within reach. So I want you to picture this moment, because imagine you being so close to your goal and then you seeing something that doesn't belong there. It wasn't a little snowbank, it was a man, sitting upright and alive, and at that altitude, that should not be possible. But when they got closer, they realized it was Lincoln Hall, who was calm, exposed, sitting cross-legged as if nothing had happened. So here's the question. If you were that close to your biggest goal, would you keep going, or would you stop? Because Lincoln looked at them and said, "I imagine you are surprised to see me here." And in that moment, the summit stopped mattering. They turned around, gave him oxygen, and stayed with him, even though every single minute would put their own lives at risk. So think about it. Would you choose to help if it cost you everything you came for? Because they did. And step by step, they brought him down. He came down alive. Because on Everest, they chose to save a life. But as with any storm, he didn't walk away untouched. The mountain did take something from him. Frostbite claimed a toe in the tips of his fingers. permanent reminders of how close he came to dying. But he did walk away. And that alone is what makes this story so different. Because Lincoln himself never tried to turn this into something heroic. He never called himself strong. He never did call himself special. He just simply said, I shouldn't be alive. And that's the part where people don't always think about, because surviving, sometimes it feels like an ending. You feel guilty about it, but it isn't, because life keeps on going the moment that should have been taken it from you. Now here's the part where people don't always think about, because surviving something like this feels like it's an ending, and you feel guilty that you did survive, but it isn't, because life keeps on going after the moment that it should have taken everything from you. Lincoln Hall came down from that mountain, believe it or not, and stepped back into life that was already moving on without him. And I want you to think about this also, because imagine his family hearing suddenly he was gone, they started to accept it, and then suddenly being told his life. I mean, how can you process that? Because Lincoln never treated survival as something heroic. He spoke about it quietly and almost like it didn't fully belong to him, as if he was passed through something rather than he achieved something. He did go back to his life and his family, carrying the memory of that night and a deeper understanding of how thin that line really truly is. As I was looking at this story, I found out years later in 2012, his story did come to a quiet end, but it wasn't on a mountain. But it was in a way that felt almost grounded compared to everything he had already survived. So that maybe that's why this story stays with you, because this isn't just a story about surviving the impossible. It's about coming back and realizing that just being here is just something you should never ever take for granted. So really think about it. Let this story sit with you, and it doesn't feel simple anymore. It's not just because the more you think about it, the harder it becomes to explain how someone survives something like that and then walks back to life. I mean, this wasn't just one time about coming together at the right time. This was years of experience shaping a man who knew how to endure, a mind that refused to shut down and that everything else was shutting down, and a group of strangers who made a decision that most people would never have to face. And if you really want to think about this for a second, because it's easy to imagine yourself doing the right thing, and it's easy to believe you would help someone, but what happens when helping someone means giving something up that you may never have another chance to achieve? I mean, on Mount Everest, just steps away from the summit, that choice to become real, in that moment, the greatest victory isn't reaching the top. It's turning around. It was choosing life over achievement. And that's the question I want to leave you with, because I don't want you to answer too quickly. I really do want you to think about it. So if you were that close to your goal, would you let it go for someone else? Because believing you would if you were in position. See, Lincoln Hall didn't just survive Everest. He came back from death and lived to tell the story. And maybe this is why this story hits so hard, and because it reminds us that sometimes truly the line between life and death, happiness and impossibilities, isn't just about strength. It's only about a decision to keep going when everything around you says you shouldn't. Some stories leave you thinking long after the end, and this is actually really one of them. Not because of how he survived, but because it makes you wonder, what would you do in that place? So if you made it to the end, thank you for watching. It does really mean a lot. And to everyone who's already subscribed, I appreciate you, seriously. And if you haven't yet subscribed, take a second to do so, because there are so many amazing and unbelievable stories coming every week. You'd never want to miss them. Make sure you check out the other videos too, because there are stories on this channel that will stay with you and in your mind for a long time after you watch them. And very soon, there's going to be new content coming to this channel, so you want to see and catch up on all of it. I'll see you in the next one, and thank you. Bye.